Hi everyone. As you're well aware, we're going to talk about Reconstruction today. Sorry about my appearance. I got off the treadmill and discovered that the video that I made for you, for whatever reason, crashed. I'm sure it was my fault technologically. Anyway, we're going to talk about construction or Reconstruction. And Reconstruction is a period after the Civil War in which people in the government of the Union worked to try to bring the Union back together, bring the South back into the Union, and rebuild the South, not to mention take care of those 4 million people who are now freed from slavery. So there are a lot of pertinent questions at this time. And as I've been telling you, oftentimes it's not the event itself that is significant in history, but we're looking at the causes that led to that event and then the effects of it. So when you look at Reconstruction, as we go through this, you think, wow, what if they had done this instead? Or what if they had done this instead? So there were some blunders along the way, but there were some good things too, because what was set into place were some laws that were going to be established that eventually, unfortunately, it was going to take a long time, that would ensure the rights of African Americans in the United States. And there were efforts to help people. But at this time, I think that the notion and the role of government was questioned. They had been questioning it in the United States up to this point with the American system, internal improvements, the bank, all sorts of things. So naturally, you know that they're going to question the events after the Civil War as well. So anyway, the questions were, how does the government bring the South back into the Union? And then there's a debate, did they even leave? Moderates and conservative Republicans would say they never really left. And Lincoln was among them because Lincoln believed that constitutionally he couldn't leave. However, the radical Republicans believed that they either had committed state suicide or that they were criminals who left the Union and therefore they had to go through certain procedures to come back in. Another question, number two here, is how would the South be rebuilt? As a result of the war, and it wasn't the government's responsibility. Actually, the government didn't really rebuild anything. They did put in place schools and hospitals and things like that to aid people after the war, but they didn't rebuild people's homes or businesses or anything like that. And then how would these newly freed Black men and women be integrated into American society? And what role should the government play in that? Also, what branch of government should control this? And this was the big debate. Should it be the executive branch, the president, or should it be Congress, the legislative branch? Okay, and then after the war, if you look at some of these things here, the South was pretty much destroyed, especially that swath down there where Sherman did his march to the sea, and Richmond and other cities as well that had just been virtually destroyed. People's plantations were destroyed, their fields, they laid fallow, so that was problematic. There were in the South about 258,000 dead from the war. That's not counting how many died in the North. Altogether, there's anywhere between 600,000 and 700,000. Since I've been teaching, that number has changed, and so probably, different historians update it. In the South too, there's a couple things here. The two brown boxes there, the South goes through this cult of mourning, right? Everybody's wearing black. Of course, for the dead, but also for this lost cause. They're in mourning for the life that they have to leave behind and that sort of thing, and they romanticize about it. And as they romanticize about that, they make their leaders, like Robert E. Lee and others, especially the generals, they memorialize them. There's the Robert E. Lee Highway, there's statues, there's all sorts of things for these Confederate leaders that were throughout the South. And only just now are they starting to be taken down. Also, this says 3.5, but there are actually 4 million freed slaves. And the issue is what to do with them. Where are they going to go? They have no property, they have no money, they don't have an education, they can't read and write. And as you know, 200,000 of them served in the military, and about 38,000 of them were killed. All right, so there's competing notions in the South between Black people And there's also competing notions between Black and white people. And there's competing notions among white people as to what freedom should look like in the South. And so for many Black people, they felt as if they should just get all the same rights, naturally, as everyone else, right? Some, though, believe that they should get redistribution of wealth to make up for enslavement. Other people just want to seek equal opportunities. All of them are united by this desire to be free and independent of white control. And they exercise this freedom and independence mostly in trying to get an education and establishing schools, not just for the children, but for also adults who wanted to learn how to read and write. And this was very crucial for them at that time because they're being forced to sign these work contracts that really ties them to the land. They do get assistance from some philanthropic and benevolent associations, but they also make some of their own as well. And they do this through their churches and through their schools and their community. One of the first things they want to do, though, of course, is look for their loved ones. For white people, they want to maintain control of the South. They don't want Black people to control them. They want independence, states' rights over the federal government, and they want to get rid of the troops. They also want to reinstate white supremacy and keep Black people tied to the land and work that for them so that they can benefit from their labor, as had been the case in the South since the beginning. All right, so then in government, the people who had control were the Republicans because the majority of the Democrats were from the South and they no longer had a say in government because they were out. But then you had competing notions between the Republican or the radical Republicans and the conservative or moderate Republicans, of which Lincoln was one of them. So you have the radical Republicans, Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, and they kind of dominate things. They believe that the civil and military leadership of the South needs to be punished. They also want to disenfranchise those people and give legal rights to Black people and protect their rights using federal troops. The more moderate ones believe that they should be accepted back into the Union with very little stipulations, and one of those being that they have to accept the abolition of slavery. Lincoln was very sympathetic to this approach. And by the way, excuse that misspelled word, few, right? Again, Lincoln didn't believe that they left the Union. All right, so this right here, this is Thaddeus Stevens on the left and Charles Sumner on the right. Thaddeus Stevens believed that the states had committed state suicide. I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember. You're going to see these people in the movie Lincoln, and one of them had a common law wife. I believe that it was Thaddeus Stevens, who everybody assumed she was a domestic servant in his home because she was a Black woman, but I believe that that was his wife. He had to keep it secret, though. I can't remember which one it was. I'll have to look that up and see. And then there's Charles Sumner. He believed that they were conquered provinces. So they believed that the Union could dominate over them and use the force of the military to do so. All right, so let's look at wartime Reconstruction. That occurs basically during the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, and then it shifts into the presidency of Andrew Johnson when Lincoln dies. So Abraham Lincoln, he did a proclamation of Reconstruction in December of 1863, and this was a while before the war ended. The war was going to end in April of 1865. So he was already looking forward to that. So our troops, the Union troops, had gone into the South to various locations, Tennessee being one of the first ones. And so what he did when those states started to be conquered and taken over by the Union, then Lincoln was working to bring them back into the Union, right? So what he says, you just have to, like 10% of the voting population that from 1860 had to pledge their loyalty to the Union. Once they did that and they accept the freedom of slaves, then they would be brought back into the Union. So those are the bar was set very, very low, especially compared to what the radical Republicans wanted. So Congress reacted by passing a law, the Wade-Davis bill. So you have Benjamin Wade, not Wad, He was a congressman from Maryland. And then Davis, who was a congressman, I forget okay, Wade was from Ohio, Davis was from Maryland. But anyway, they wanted 50% of the voting population to give an ironclad oath of loyalty and to also state that they never actively participated in the rebellion. They also required that the states they have constitutional conventions, and they get rid of slavery, and the conventions are going to be run by people who were not Confederate. So Lincoln saw this and he did nothing. And he did nothing while they were not in session. So it had the same impact as a veto. So nothing ever happened to it. But you can see the difference there between Congress and Lincoln. So this is the oath. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it says up here, you solemnly swear that you never bore arms against the military. And then down towards the bottom, it says that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And that's pretty much the same oath you have to take when you join the military. You don't pledge an oath to the President of the United States, your commander-in-chief. You pledge an oath to the Constitution. All right, here's just a scene. No, I want you to look at this cartoon. This cartoon, at the time, they have thought bubbles, right? Those are going to disappear because we're going to get a new sort of method of doing political cartoons with the father of modern day political cartoons, which is Thomas Nast. There's going to be a whole bunch of Thomas Nast cartoons in here. But Davis was captured, and this cartoon is all about him complaining about the food that he has to eat. And the Union troops are like, yeah, you didn't, say that at, whatever battle. All right, so one of the things that Lincoln had been working on before he was killed was the 13th Amendment. Now, the president really doesn't have a say in amending the Constitution. It has to be proposed by Congress and approved by the states. But what Lincoln did is he worked behind the scenes to try to encourage congressmen to vote for a proposal. So this was put out there. And it passed, it passed the Senate, but then it failed initially in the House. It was like 3 votes shy. All Republicans voted for it, and I think all but just a few of the Democrats voted against it. Lincoln's platform, when he ran for re-election in 1864, was to get the 13th Amendment, and so he and Seward did this sort of a campaign to encourage congressmen to vote for it. And you're going to see that in the movie Lincoln as well. But anyway, it finally passes through the House and the Senate in January of 1865. So Lincoln lived to see this go through and then be sent to the states where he was sure that it would be ratified. And of course it was. But it wasn't ratified until after his death, December of 1865. All right, one of the things that the government created to aid African Americans and poor whites was the Freedmen's Bureau. This was created in March of 1865, and it was already needed because even though the South hadn't surrendered yet, there were large territories where now we have all these freed men and women wandering around and what to do with them. So the official name was the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. And this was it was a huge step for the federal government. I'd never done anything like this before. What it did, as you can see here, it helped Black people mostly find loved ones and family members, give them food, clothing, shelter, the main essentials, right? Food, clothing, shelter, water. But then also they built schools. This was probably their greatest accomplishment, was doing that. Also churches and helping out any way that they could. So this was kind of an early welfare agency for Black and poor white people. Initially, some of the generals who came through, they would confiscate land of these Confederates and they would redistribute it to Black people. And the cry was 40 acres and a mule. So a lot of people are like, yeah, give us land. That's what we need. We need land so that we could survive. They knew how to work it. That's the only thing they'd been allowed to do all their lives. So if they had a mule, 40 acres, it would be good. But what happened, the Confederates, as they get pardoned and then things kind of start turning back to the way they used to be, the courts start ruling that they cannot their land cannot be taken, and so it has to be given back to them at this time. So what we see also with the Freedmen's Bureau, there were volunteers, hundreds and hundreds of people, many of whom came down from the north, who helped out to assist these people. They were teachers, they helped in the medical field, they provided all the necessities that people needed. They kind of came down and did it. The South didn't like this. Southern Democrats called them, well, just Southerners, because most of them were Democrats, unless they were black. Then they were Republicans. But anyway, they called them carpetbaggers, and that was a derogatory term that we're going to talk more about here in a minute. Okay, so if you look at the Freedmen's Bureau too, if you see this image, probably the greatest thing that prevented basically race riots or race wars in the South was the Freedmen's Bureau, because it protected freed slaves at that very crucial time period after they were freed, keeping them from being re-enslaved or oppressed or murdered. So the military being down there, it was crucial that they were there. The person who oversaw a lot of the Freedmen's Bureau, all of the Freedmen's Bureau, he was appointed to run it, was General Oliver O. Howard. And he was a very devout Christian who had this real desire to help the freed men and women in the South. And he was supported by and supportive of the radical Republicans. He was very frustrated when Johnson became president. What he wanted to do is protect freedmen from these labor contracts that you're going to learn were being put in place by people in the South. Because of his efforts, there was one black university that was named after him, was Howard University, because there were other black universities as well. But anyway, this one is in Washington, D.C., and it's still around today. It's a very famous university. Currently, their enrollment has about 89% African American, and of that, they have a large female population, 69%. Okay, so the Freedmen's Bureau, as I mentioned previously, probably their greatest accomplishment was in education. They established nearly 3,000 schools. This one right here is in St. Helena's Island in South Carolina. And as I said, there are black colleges as well. Freed people, adults and children alike, they flocked to these schools. That's one of the first things they did. They set these up so that they could learn how to read and write. They'd been deprived of it for a really long time. So this is very symbolic too of freedom, and it was very practical because they needed to be able to read these labor contracts that are going to be produced for them. Johnson ended the funding for this in 1870, but by the time that happened, there were already 200,000 black men, women, children who had learned how to read and write. Okay, but the South did not like the Freedmen's Bureau very much. This is an image of what their impression is of them, right? Freedmen's Bureau here, plenty to eat and nothing to do. So people just sitting around with all this food, being very, very lazy and not doing anything, which was not the case at all. Okay, so Lincoln, in his last speech, people flocked to the White House after the war is over, and they call upon him to give a speech. So he comes to the window with his son Ted, and he read some prepared remarks. But anyway, what he did is he's kind of encouraging, first off, Louisiana to be admitted back into the Union. Like I said, he wanted this to be very quick. He also implicated that he wanted black people who were educated or who had served in the military to be able to vote. John Wilkes Booth reportedly was in the audience that day and mumbled under his breath, "That is the last speech he will give." Ugh. All right, so anyway, Lincoln's governments, some of them were already readmitted. You can see some of them here. Well, no, you can't. It doesn't show it on this map. Bad map. But anyway, there was Arkansas, Louisiana, and Tennessee. But one thing that you're going to see is, and that's what this map indicates, is that Congress, when they start overseeing Reconstruction, they're going to negate what Lincoln and Johnson did. They're like, no, we're not accepting anybody in until they meet our standards, right? And then what's the South going to do? Well, we protest. Well, so what, right? So the radical Republicans, they wouldn't allow these representatives to Congress without the passage of the Wade-Davis bill. So basically those seats were still vacant, and what Lincoln and Johnson did were null and void, because Johnson's like, you're not coming into Congress, or Congress was like that. All right, so now we get presidential reconstruction. So we had wartime. Now we're going to get presidential from Johnson's perspective once he becomes the president. Excuse me. So this is Andrew Johnson, and of all the presidents of the United States, he probably came from the most humble means. He was very, very poor. He grew up in Tennessee, and he taught himself how to be a tailor. I don't know how he rose to the ranks of congressman, but he did. The one thing, though, he championed the poor. He identified with them, and he had all this animosity towards white people, wealthy white people in the South, the plantation owners. So he said, damn the Negroes, I'm fighting these traitorous aristocrats, their masters. So the radical Republicans are thinking, yeah, this is somebody that we can work with. The only thing is, he was a racist, and he kind of elevated himself at this position where he's going to grant amnesty to these people. And I think that he just liked the position of having power over the aristocracy of the South. He did agree, though, that the states had never left the Union, and so that they should come back easily, right? It shouldn't be a real problem to do that. Again, the only reason he was appointed as or chosen as the vice presidential candidate for Lincoln in the 1864 presidential election is because he was a Democrat and he was from the South, which of course this is going to create problems when the Republicans try to work with him. All right, so here was Johnson's plan. It was the 10% plus plan, right? As I said, initially the Republicans welcomed him. But what he said is that we are going to disenfranchise Confederate office holders. That means that people who were in the Confederacy and they had high-ranking positions, they could not vote. And anybody who was rich, too, in the South. So if you had $20,000 of taxable property, then you couldn't vote anyway either. So we're going to get rid of all those top people, and that was his plan. But they could appeal to him and give him an oath of loyalty, and he would pardon them. Do you see? He's putting himself in power, in charge of these people that he despises. So it gives him this sense of authority over them. Also, they have to have these new constitutions with the minimum requirements. They have to repudiate slavery and secession, saying that was wrong, that you can't do that you're part of the Union, and their state debts, right? So their state debt had to be paid, no slavery, they had to ratify the 13th Amendment, and they had to say that secession was bad. Then what he did is he named these provisional governors to all these Confederate states. So he appointed them as the president of the United States. All right, so with the effects here, there were some Confederates were disenfranchised for a while, but then he starts pardoning all these planter aristocrats, and they start to take control of political offices. The Republicans are outraged by this, and people are wondering who won this war. Why did we suffer the loss of so many people, and yet it's going back to the way that it was? Also, we start to see very early on that there's violence that's being used against African Americans in the South. So it's very problematic. This political cartoon was done by Thomas Nast, and there's a lot of different stories about it. One of them is a scene, I think it's on the top left. This is a riot in Colfax, Louisiana, where a Republican was elected governor, and the white Democrats rioted, and in doing, they killed probably about 150 black people because they were just furious. Okay, so we get these Southern governments in 1865 that start to be controlled by former Confederates. So the state constitutions abided by Johnson's guidelines for readmission. right? They repudiated secession, they negated their debts, and they ratified the 13th Amendment. But they didn't extend voting rights to Black people. So what's happening is they're having elections, and these former Confederates are getting elected to Congress, including Vice President Alexander Stephens of the Confederacy. He's elected to the Georgia Senate. And so, as you can imagine, the North was outraged. Right, and here's a political cartoon. You can see on the left, this is Colombia, the representation of the United States, who is pardoning all these Confederates, and I believe that that's Robert E. Lee in front of Colombia. Yet there's this injured African American soldier right here who is being denied the right to vote. And as I said, the North is very angry. They feel that the actions didn't reflect a Northern victory in the war at all. Right, here's another political cartoon by Thomas Nast, and it shows the change, right? How things were and how they are. So before, Colombia is right there turning a blind eye while a Black man is being bought and sold on the auction block of the slave market. And then we get the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, and the heading on this is "Slavery is Dead," really? And now a Black man on the right, while Colombia is being blindfolded, and presumably it's in like South Carolina because we got a palm tree there, is being beaten for a crime, right? So this was 5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, which can give you some indication of what people were thinking. This is what's going on in the South after we fought this long, bloody Civil War. All right, so then another thing they do during Johnson's administration in the South is white Southerners create these black codes. Mississippi is the first place to do this in 1865, and then other states follow. What they do is they prohibit Black people from renting land or borrowing money to buy land. So they didn't want Black people to have control of land. By doing that, then the Black men are they're like, well, what am I going to do? I have to earn an income somehow. So they made it illegal for Black people to be vagrants. So you couldn't be a vagrant, and you had to be an apprentice, and you had to sign this work contract, or an apprentice. So you had to sign a work contract. You had to show that you weren't a vagrant, meaning somebody who's just an unemployed, like a homeless person. So if you were a vagrant, then you would be in prison, and if you were in prison, you would get out of prison by working or paying a fine, but you couldn't pay the fine because you couldn't work, right? So you had to get a contract. So what they did is they had to sign off on these contracts. They were also prohibited from testifying against white people in court, and even from being on a jury. So again, the North is wondering who won this war. So Congress challenges the election results of 1866, and they refuse to seat Alexander Stephens. So now it's going to be war against Johnson in Congress, right? So again, here's the black codes, what their purpose was. They wanted a stable labor force. They were going to force Black people legally through these binding contracts to work on the land. And we're going to talk about this in the next lecture, part 2, where we talk about tenant farming and sharecropping. So it forced many of these Black people to work on the land to do that for white people. And these contracts were so binding that when Black people eventually wanted to move north to work in industrial jobs, they had to actually sneak out of the South. And this is as late as like 1930, 1940. It was very difficult. All right, so what Congress does is they start passing laws to prevent this sort of action from taking place in the South, and Johnson starts vetoing it. So one of them was an extension of the Freedmen's Bureau to expand it and expand the power over the Black codes. Johnson vetoes it in February of 1866. Then there's the Civil Rights Act of 1865. It would have guaranteed citizenship for Black people. Johnson vetoes that. Congress overrides it. Congress overrode the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau too. Then there was the Reconstruction Act, which established military districts in the South. He vetoed it in March of 1867. Congress overrides it. Keep in mind, there's a presidential election in 1868, and as you can imagine, he's not going to get elected. Then he vetoes the second Reconstruction Act, In March 23rd, 1867, Congress overrides that. What these were supposed to do is protect Black people, because by this time we get the emergence of the White League, the KKK, and other organizations that were oppressing Black people and using violence against them. All right, so anyway, during this time, during Johnson's Reconstruction, 11 states were readmitted to the Union, and the Confederates held office, and the South enacted the Black Code. So it was disastrous for freed African Americans. So Congress is going to take over. And then we get Congressional Reconstruction. All right, so here you see Johnson, and he's got the veto, right? And it's the Freedmen's Bureau, and he's kind of kicking that box, and you can see these freedmen are kind of flying out this way. But anyway, Johnson, he has some nerve. He denounces the radical Republicans, saying that they are traitors, and specifically those people were Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, and then also Wendell Phillips, who was a strong abolitionist before the war. So then Congress creates this Joint Committee of Reconstruction, and they get together and they investigate what's going on, and then they look at things that they can do to improve the situation. So they have a committee there, and that's all they do is they're putting together these things. So that begins that round of congressional reconstruction. And this right here is a cartoon by Thomas Nast, the veto. Notice no more thought bubbles that are in there. All right, so here the drama queen Johnson, he thinks that he is like Samson, right? That he is trying to preserve the government, the purity and character and all of that. And if it is necessary, take me and lay me upon it, and the blood that now warms and animates my existence shall be poured out as a fit libation to the Union. He sees himself as the martyr. So anyway, we get the radical Republicans, and they're in charge, and the moderates are going to kind of come along too, right? So this is kind of redundant of what I just talked about. They believe that strongly that Black people should have the same rights as white people, and that Confederates need to be punished. So Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, they oppose Johnson very vehemently, right? And as I said, they establish that joint committee, and one person who goes down there and investigates the South is a man by the name of Carl Schurz, and he had been an abolitionist too, and he supports the radical Republicans. So he confirmed that freed Blacks were granted only minimal freedoms. Moderate Republicans were mostly concerned with the development with how the country's going to come back together at that time, but they align with the radical Republicans because their main interest at this time is opposing the Democrat Party, right? But you're going to see they get more on board to help protect African Americans, freed African Americans, because when they vote for Republicans, right? So they start to pursue legislation that's going to aid African Americans. We're going to look at that now. One was the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It declared that all people born in the United States were citizens, and they had the right to make contracts, to own property, to sue in court, and full protection of the law. So basically, this repudiated Dred Scott. So they passed a law. Now the Supreme Court, people can't argue, well, but precedence was established with Dred Scott, right? So this gave the U.S. district courts the right for jurisdiction over these criminal cases, so that thereby Black people couldn't be tried in these local courts where they're going to be abused. It also gradually started to transform all these courts into forums where people could then argue for their constitutional rights. It was vetoed, of course, by Johnson, but then it was overridden by Congress. This is the Joint Commission on Reconstruction right here. It's about that thick. And basically one thing that Congress said is it's Congress's duty, not the President of the United States, to oversee Reconstruction. And I would have to agree. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that the President would have the authority to make law like this, because that's a legislative duty, just like Congress has the authority to grant new states. So this would probably be the case. So essentially, this nullified the president's plan, and then what they do, they set forth putting together the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment, this is one of the longer amendments to the Constitution. The first one declared that all people born in the United States are in fact citizens of the United States and they're guaranteed the equal protection of the law. Section 2 basically nullifies the Three-Fifths Compromise that was put in place when the Constitution was written, saying that five black people constituted three people. Right. So what this is going to do, it's actually going to make it to where the South had greater representation in Congress than what they did before. And when white people take over, that means that there's more white people from the South in Congress than there was before. It also barred former Confederate leaders from holding office unless Congress voted otherwise, which they're going to do with an Amnesty Act. And it said any debts that were incurred by the federal government were valid, but those incurred by the Confederacy were not. But those had to be paid, and nobody is going to be compensated for their slaves. And it also gave Congress the right to enforce this law. All right, at the midterm elections of 1866, the battle between Congress and Johnson goes to the polls, right? So Johnson thinks that as the martyr, and he's right, he goes around the country on these whistle-stop tours giving this speech, talking about pushing his plan. And he's giving all of these speeches. He attacked the radical Republicans, and he said if they have their way, then black people would have so many rights that we would Africanize American society. But it turns out Republicans won by a 3-to-1 majority in both the House and in the Senate. So it backfired on Johnson. All right, the Republicans, though, in this election, what they did in campaigning, they were talking about, how the South led to this war, and the South was equated with the Democrats, and so the Democrats criticized them as waving the bloody shirt, like taking advantage of the memory of the Civil War just for political gain, right? So, but the Democrats did that too in the South. They used it in a manner to campaign in the South for the lost cause, right? All right, so here, what Congress is going to do, they're going to pass the Reconstruction Acts. So the first one, this one, 1867, they're going to divide the South into these military districts, right? This was passed in March. Each district was under the control of the Union Army, and the military was authorized to enroll Black people, authorized to make them eligible to vote, and then also establish it so that they could be at the constitutional conventions to create new state constitutions, right? So they were the authority in these areas because it was under martial law. It also increased the requirement for the states to return to the Union, requiring that the new states include Black suffrage, ratification of the 13th and 14th Amendments. All right, other laws that they passed were right here, the Command of the Army and the Tenure of Office Acts. So Johnson was not only having combat with Congress, but also he's fighting against Lincoln's cabinet, specifically against Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War. So what Congress does to protect these members of Lincoln's cabinet was they pass a law called the Tenure of Office Act that said that it would be unconstitutional for the President of the United States to fire anyone within his cabinet without the consent of cabinet because the Senate was required to approve them, right? It was designed to protect the radical Republicans within Lincoln's government. Johnson challenged it by firing Edwin Stanton, who is right here. Stanton refuses to leave. He locks himself in his office. And he doesn't go anywhere. So then, because Johnson violated a federal law, then Congress moves to impeach him, and the House does that by a vote of 126 to 47, clearly along party lines. It was all very, very political. They charged him for violating that, and they brought the act and bringing it a disgrace, ridicule, hatred, contempt, and reproach to the Congress of the United States. That's what they said, end quote, supposed to be one there. They didn't even have articles impeachment. They just impeached him. Then they drafted up the articles and they sent them to the Senate. So the Senate was the biggest ticket in town. Everybody wanted to come. If this whole trial it lasted for 3 months. In the end, though, they didn't get the necessary 2/3 vote for him to be kicked out of office. It was 35-19. There were 7 moderate Republicans who joined the Democrats because they believed that this was purely political and that would set a dangerous precedent for the future. So they voted against impeachment. But then we come to the election of 1868, and the Democrats, they choose to run this man by the name of Horatio Seymour. Now, he was a Copperhead Peace Democrat who was very, very critical of the Republicans as being unpatriotic, very similar to Johnson. And the Republicans nominate the war hero Ulysses S. Grant. So now at this time, there were some African Americans in the South who were able to vote, and 500,000 of them did, in the North and in the South, actually. So African Americans at this time, when they voted for Republicans. So if you look at this political cartoon here, Thomas Nast did it too, and he was a strong supporter of the Republicans and of General Ulysses S. Grant. And here he's equating a vote for Seymour was a vote for the KKK and the White League in the South, right? So anyway, he's saying that these guys are bad. So the moderate Republicans were a little bit scared by this. It kind of woke them up, and they said, "Hey, we need to protect the voting rights of African Americans because they're going to vote for us," and this was too close. So they were fearful that they would lose elections. All right, so in the presidential election, you can see right here, Grant won the electoral vote pretty handily, but the popular vote was very, very close against Horatio Seymour. All right, and then between the time that Grant was elected president and his inauguration, Johnson, on Christmas Day, he gives this great gift to all the Confederates. He pardons all of them unconditionally, without reservation. He pardons everyone. It's kind of like get back at you. Right, but then to ensure that Black people get the right to vote in the South, Congress moves to pass the 15th Amendment. Right, so they're all on board for this. It was proposed February of 1869, just right after the November 1868 presidential election. The vote in the House was 144, all Republicans, to 44, with mostly, well, I think they were all Democrats, with 35 people not voting. The final vote in the Senate, 39-13, with 14 not voting. So the right to vote was denied to African Americans, not only in the South, but also in the North. So this was kind of a compromise measure. It had been much larger and much more defined to try to ensure that protections would be given to people when they do try to vote, but then they kind of pared it down, and you're going to see what it says. It didn't prevent stipulations. So as you know, in the South, they're going to prevent African Americans from voting through poll tax, through literacy tests, through grandfather clause. And a lot of women were like, wait, why are we giving Black men who don't know how to read and write, who have been enslaved all their lives, the right to vote? They didn't believe that they didn't have the right to. It's just that why not give women the right to vote as well? So they're going to be upset about this. All right, so here, if you look, this is not a Thomas Nast. This is Alfred Waud. And there's a few of his in here too. So African Americans do get the right to vote in the South, and you can see the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be infringed, abridged, or denied on account of slavery or condition, race, color, or previous condition of servitude. I'm sorry, I'm preoccupied with this image. If you look right here at this image, you can see that when African Americans got the right to vote, they did. And they're from all walks of life. The man in the front You know, he's in torn clothes, obviously a former slave. The man behind him, maybe he has some money. Um, I've read that one of the first things that African Americans did when they got their freedom, if they had any money, they really wanted to wear nice clothes. They wanted to look good. They wanted to feel good about them. They wanted to feel human. And then the person behind him is a veteran of the Civil War. And then you got this white guy right here, kind of glaring at the black man who, at least in my mind, that's what he's doing. The black man who is voting. And notice what the voting, there's two different things. They would set these up there. You could vote for this person or this person. So there wasn't a secret ballot. So everybody knew how you're going to vote. And you could be intimidated at the polls at that time. All right, and then we're going to get the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which would be the last Civil Rights Act for like 90 years. What it said is it guaranteed equal rights or equal accommodations of public places, hotels, theaters, railroad stations for all people. It was supposed to always also allow African Americans to serve on juries and to get a fair jury trial. The only thing is, it's very similar to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, except that this one wasn't enforced and there was nothing in it which said that it would guarantee enforcement. All right, thanks for listening.